Defense attorneys, however, signaled that they would challenge that narrative at every turn. They argued that toxicology, while precise and controlled laboratory settings, could become far less certain when applied retrospectively to a complex clinical picture. Medical records would be scrutinized line by line, with the defense suggesting alternative explanations for the gastrointestinal distress, the sudden cardiovascular instability, and the cascading organ failure that followed. In pretrial motions, both sides sparred over how much of the scientific detail the jury would hear. Prosecutors sought to introduce demonstrative charts mapping colchine's absorption, distribution, and lethal thresholds, hoping to show that Betty's deterioration followed a textbook progression: initial nausea and vomiting, a deceptive period of temporary stabilization, and then the irreversible collapse of vital systems. The defense countered that medicine is rarely textbook in real life and warned against what they called the illusion of certainty. Yet the defense aimed to fracture that cohesion. They suggested that digital searches could reflect curiosity rather than intent, that purchase records might lack definitive proof of use, and that the smoothies, while suspicious in hindsight, were circumstantial without direct evidence of contamination. Their strategy would hinge on introducing doubt not by disproving every allegation, but by reframing the narrative as a series of assumptions layered atop ambiguous facts. In court, jurors would likely hear competing interpretations of the same timeline. Prosecutors would walk them step by step through the sequence: the searches conducted late at night, the acquisition of the substance, the preparation of the drinks, and the onset of symptoms that followed. They would argue that the progression was too orderly to be accidental, too aligned with toxicological expectations to be coincidence. The defense, in contrast, would emphasize gaps, moments unaccounted for, alternative access points, the absence of eyewitness testimony directly tying Connor to a lethal act. They would remind jurors that suspicion, however strong, is not synonymous with proof. And in that tension between pattern and possibility, the trial would ultimately turn on whether the prosecution's narrative felt inevitable or merely plausible. Financial records were added to the growing archive of evidence, revealing purchases that prosecutors argued were anything but routine. Surveillance footage from nearby stores was reviewed frame by frame, and timestamps were cross-referenced against cell tower pings to narrow the window of opportunity. Investigators built a chronological map so precise that even brief gaps of unaccounted time drew scrutiny. Friends and coworkers were interviewed to assess Connor's demeanor in the days before and after Betty fell ill. Some described him as calm, even attentive at the hospital bedside. Others recalled subtle tensions in the relationship that, in retrospect, seemed more significant. Detectives weighed each account carefully, distinguishing between hindsight interpretation and verifiable fact. What emerged was not a chaotic sequence of events, but a tightly constructed timeline. Prosecutors believed that its clarity would resonate with jurors: a single actor, a defined opportunity, and a progression of events that unfolded with chilling consistency. Whether that narrative would withstand the adversarial rigor of trial remained to be seen, but investigators were confident that the structure of the case, methodical, solitary, and deliberate, would be difficult to dismantle. Colleagues at the Mayo Clinic were questioned extensively. Many expressed shock that someone training in medicine could weaponize pharmacological knowledge in such a way. Several described Connor as intelligent but reserved, someone who rarely revealed personal struggles. In hindsight, some recalled moments of envy when Betty received praise or professional recognition. Investigators were careful not to rely too heavily on retrospective impressions. Professional rivalry is not uncommon in competitive medical environments, they noted, and envy alone does not equate to motive. Still, prosecutors believe the testimony helped establish context, a portrait of a man who understood drug mechanisms intimately and who may have felt overshadowed in ways he never openly articulated. Emails between colleagues were reviewed for tone and subtext. Performance evaluations were examined to determine whether career setbacks or perceived slights might have intensified private resentments. No document provided a confession or overt hostility, but prosecutors argued that motive often resides in accumulation rather than explosion, a quiet layering of grievances that rarely announces itself until after irreversible harm is done. As the investigation deepened, the contrast between Connor's clinical training and the alleged method of harm became a central theme. If the state's theory proved correct, it suggested not a crime of impulse but of calculation, one that relied on patience, timing, and a precise understanding of how the human body would respond. Whether jurors would interpret that expertise as damning evidence or as circumstantial framing would ultimately determine how the story ended in the courtroom. Betty's autopsy results ultimately confirmed toxic levels of colchicine in her system. The concentration found in her blood was far beyond any accepted therapeutic range. Pathologists concluded that the poisoning had triggered a cascade of multi-organ failure, consistent with the rapid deterioration witnessed in intensive care. The official cause of death was ruled a homicide. That determination marked a turning point. What had once been a baffling medical crisis was now formally classified as a criminal act. The autopsy findings provided prosecutors with a definitive medical anchor they needed: objective laboratory data, correlated with tissue analysis, that aligned with the clinical trajectory described by treating physicians. In pretrial filings, the state emphasized how the toxicology results narrowed alternative explanations. Accidental environmental exposure was deemed implausible at the measured concentration. A dispensing error at a pharmacy was ruled out by prescription records. The level detected, experts asserted, suggested deliberate administration rather than inadvertent ingestion. For the defense, the challenge became more acute. With the manner of death officially ruled a homicide, the central question for jurors would no longer be what killed Betty, but who was responsible, and whether the prosecution could eliminate reasonable doubt about how and by whom the fatal dose was introduced. As the case moved closer to opening statements, the science that had once seemed abstract became starkly personal. Charts, lab reports, and expert testimony would translate into a simple, weighty allegation that someone with knowledge and access had turned a powerful medication into a lethal instrument, and that the evidence now pointed decisively toward intent rather than tragedy. As the case gained public attention, media outlets began reporting on the disturbing irony: a medical professional allegedly using specialized knowledge to commit murder. The story spread across Minnesota and beyond, sparking conversations about trust within healthcare professions. For many, the betrayal felt especially chilling because it involved someone sworn to preserve life. Commentators across the state questioned how such an act could unfold within institutions built on ethical codes and patient welfare. Editorials debated whether the incident reflected a personal moral collapse or exposed vulnerabilities in oversight systems. Talk radio programs and community forums filled with listeners grappling with a difficult tension: admiration for medical expertise on one hand, and the unsettling reminder that expertise can be misused on the other. Within hospitals and training programs, the discussion turned inward. Administrators reiterated screening procedures and professional conduct standards, emphasizing that the overwhelming majority of clinicians practice with integrity and compassion. Still, the case cast a long shadow. For patients, the idea that knowledge intended to heal could instead be weaponized struck at the core of the implicit trust placed in caregivers. As trial proceedings approached, public interest only intensified. Court filings were dissected online, and each new detail reignited debate. What had begun as a private tragedy had evolved into a broader reckoning, one that forced communities to confront not only the specifics of the alleged crime, but the fragile bond of trust that underpins modern medicine. Friends of Betty organized memorial events celebrating her accomplishments and character. They described her as compassionate, brilliant, and driven by a genuine desire to help patients. Scholarships in her name were discussed, intended to support pharmacy students who shared her dedication to ethical practice. In this way, those who loved her sought to ensure her legacy would not be defined solely by the circumstances of her death. Vigils were held where colleagues and former classmates shared stories of late-night study sessions, clinical rotations, and the small, quiet acts of kindness that rarely make headlines but define a life in healthcare. Mentors spoke of her intellectual curiosity and her insistence on double-checking dosages and protocols, not out of fear, but out of respect for the patients who trusted her. Plans for a memorial scholarship began to take shape, with organizers outlining criteria that reflected her values: academic excellence, humility, and a demonstrated commitment to ethical decision-making. The fund, they said, would serve as a living tribute, an investment in future pharmacists who understood that knowledge carries responsibility. As the legal process moved forward, those closest to Betty focused deliberately on remembrance rather than accusation. They wanted the public to know her not as a headline, but as a person, someone whose ambitions, compassion, and integrity extended far beyond the courtroom narrative. Through tributes and tangible acts of generosity, they sought to reclaim her story and anchor it in the purpose that had defined her life. Behind bars, Connor maintained his composure during preliminary hearings. Observers noted that he appeared attentive and calm, occasionally conferring with his legal team, but displaying little visible emotion. Whether this demeanor reflected confidence, denial, or calculated restraint remained a matter of speculation. Legal experts cautioned against reading too much into courtroom behavior. Defendants are advised to present themselves respectfully and avoid displays that could be misinterpreted by jurors or the public. Calmness, they noted, is not proof of guilt or innocence. It is simply a facet of navigating a highly adversarial process. Meanwhile, the hearings themselves focused on procedural questions, admissibility of evidence, standards for expert testimony, and the scope of information that would ultimately reach the jury. Both sides sought to shape the evidentiary landscape in advance of trial, arguing over what would be relevant, reliable, and fair. For the public following the case, each procedural development carried emotional weight. Some viewed the defendant's composure as chilling. Others interpreted it as an attempt to endure an immensely difficult situation with dignity. Yet the preliminary stage of a criminal case rarely resolves questions of culpability. It instead sets the stage for the more comprehensive examination that would occur at trial, where evidence could be tested and conclusions reached under the scrutiny of cross-examination and judicial oversight. Legal analysts predicted that digital evidence would play a decisive role at trial. Modern investigations leave little room for anonymity in online activity. Search histories, timestamps, and electronic purchase confirmations often provide an unfiltered look into a suspect's intent. In this case, prosecutors believed those digital footprints would be compelling. If jurors accepted that the searches were made by the defendant and occurred before the alleged offense, the state would argue they revealed planning or at least foreknowledge. Defense attorneys, by contrast, would likely emphasize context, suggesting that online queries can reflect curiosity, academic interest, or concern for a loved one rather than preparation for wrongdoing. Electronic evidence carries unique persuasive power because it appears objective and precise. A timestamp does not rely on memory, and a search term can be reproduced for the jury to see. Yet experts caution that interpretation matters as much as collection. A phrase typed into a search engine does not automatically explain intent, and isolating digital data from the human circumstances surrounding it risks oversimplification. At trial, both sides would present competing narratives of the same records. Prosecutors would highlight patterns they believed demonstrated a logical progression toward the alleged crime. The defense would attempt to introduce alternative explanations and challenge assumptions about what the data truly signified. Ultimately, the jury would be tasked with weighing that evidence alongside the broader factual record to determine whether guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Legal analysts predicted that digital evidence would play a decisive role at trial. Modern investigations leave little room for anonymity in online activity. Search histories, timestamps, and electronic purchase confirmations often provide an unfiltered look into a suspect's intent. In this case, prosecutors believed those digital footprints would be compelling. If jurors accepted that the searches were made by the defendant and occurred before the alleged offense, the state would argue they revealed planning or at least foreknowledge. Defense attorneys, by contrast, would likely emphasize context, suggesting that online queries can reflect curiosity, academic interest, or concern for a loved one rather than preparation for wrongdoing. Electronic evidence carries unique persuasive power because it appears objective and precise. A timestamp does not rely on memory, and a search term can be reproduced for the jury to see. Yet experts caution that interpretation matters as much as collection. A phrase typed into a search engine does not automatically explain intent, and isolating digital data from the human circumstances surrounding it risks oversimplification. At trial, both sides would present competing narratives of the same records. Prosecutors would highlight patterns they believed demonstrated a logical progression toward the alleged crime. The defense would attempt to introduce alternative explanations and challenge assumptions about what the data truly signified. Ultimately, the jury would be tasked with weighing that evidence alongside the broader factual record to determine whether guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. As court proceedings approached, Betty's family prepared victim impact statements. They wanted the court to understand not only the medical facts, but the human cost. A daughter, a sister, a friend, her absence left a permanent void. No verdict could restore what had been taken. In their statements, family members described everyday moments now transformed into memories, shared meals, holiday traditions, and quiet conversations that once anchored their lives. They spoke of the plans Betty had for the future, professional aspirations and personal dreams that would now remain unrealized. The purpose of the statements, they emphasized, was not retribution but acknowledgement, recognition that the consequences of the alleged act extended far beyond legal definitions of harm. Victim impact statements play a recognized role in the sentencing phase of criminal proceedings, offering courts insight into the emotional and social repercussions of a crime. While they do not determine guilt or innocence, they provide context for understanding the broader effects of the conduct at issue. Supporters argue that such testimony humanizes the legal process, reminding all participants that cases involve real people and irreversible losses. For the family, speaking before the court represented a difficult but meaningful step. They hoped that sharing their experiences would honor Betty's memory and underscore the gravity of the events under examination. Regardless of the trial's outcome, they sought recognition of her life and the enduring impact of her absence, an acknowledgement that justice, however defined, cannot erase grief, but can affirm the value of the person who was lost. Community members in Rochester followed developments closely. The case served as a sobering reminder that violence does not always appear dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, hidden behind ordinary routines and familiar faces. That realization unsettled many who had once viewed the couple as simply another young professional pair building a life together. The prosecution signaled that it would seek the maximum penalty if Connor were convicted. In Minnesota, first-degree murder carries the possibility of life imprisonment. The gravity of the charge reflected the alleged deliberation behind the act. This was not presented as a crime of passion, but as one of calculation. For Betty's loved ones, justice would mean accountability, though it could never mean closure in the truest sense. Grief does not follow the schedule of court dates or verdict announcements. It lingers long after headlines fade and public attention shifts elsewhere. In the months and years that follow, families often describe learning to live alongside loss rather than moving beyond it. Milestones arrive without the person who once would have celebrated them. Ordinary moments, an inside joke, a familiar scent, a photograph, can reopen memories with surprising intensity. Healing, experts note, is not a linear process, but a gradual adaptation to a new reality. Courts can determine responsibility and impose consequences within the framework of law. They can acknowledge harm and affirm societal norms. But emotional recovery belongs to those directly affected, unfolding in private spaces and quiet conversations. Support systems, friends, counseling, and community play an essential role in helping individuals navigate that journey. For Betty's family, the proceedings represented both a painful reckoning and a necessary step toward understanding what had happened. Whatever verdict emerged, it would address questions of legal culpability. The deeper work of remembrance and adaptation would remain personal, shaped by time and the enduring bonds of love and memory. As the legal process continues, the case stands as a stark illustration of how knowledge, when stripped of ethics, can become dangerous. What began as a promising partnership between two healthcare professionals ended in tragedy. Now, the final chapter will be written not in a hospital room, but in a courtroom where evidence, not appearances, will determine the truth.